Afternoon now. Welcome to all here. It couldn't be really, from point of view of policy exchange and our educational mission, a better timed event in the light of the emerging crisis on Iran. We hadn't necessarily planned it this way, but it's certainly, we've got the right panel of outstanding thinkers and experts in the matter to address all the dimensions of the present crisis there, both in terms of the domestic situation on the ground, the human rights situation, women's protests, and of course the emerging second nuclear deal and Iran's wider threat in terms of its neighbours and the security picture as relates also to the United States, the UK, France and other allies on the ground and on the high seas there in the Gulf region. So it's a particular pleasure, as I say, we've got this outstanding international panel which has come together most felicitously at relatively short notice. I'm just hoping that Nazanin Boniadi from New York coming in from
Can
New
you
York.
hear
Can
me?
you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear. Very welcome. Obviously one of the preeminent voices on human rights, on the situation on the ground in Iran, Iranian-born herself, Ambassador at Large for Amnesty International. Nazanin, do you want to just kick off for 5 minutes apiece for the panelists, and then after all our speakers have spoken, we'll throw it over to the floor for questions. Nazanin.
Thank you for having me, Lord Godson, on this esteemed panel. I'd like to start by talking a little about the current crisis in Iran, then bust a couple of myths, and finally offer a way forward.
Can everyone hear? Sorry, can everyone hear? Not really, sorry. Can we have it, sorry to hold, in New York? More volume. Why don't you go ahead? I'm sorry to cut you off.
No, that's okay. Can you hear me?
No, it's got worse.
Oh dear. I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to fix this.
Bear with me. I think it's better now. Do you want to have a go?
Okay. Okay, I'll try again. I'd like to start by talking a little about the current crisis in Iran, then bust a couple of myths, and finally offer a way forward. I've been working in the Iran human rights advocacy space for 14 years now. Never during this time have I witnessed such disillusionment with and opposition to the Islamic Republic regime as there is in Iran today. While Iran has become accustomed to mass protests once every decade, neither the student protests of 1999 nor the Green Movement of 2009 or even the more recent November 2019 protests compare in fervor or magnitude to the current 2022 protests, in which for the first time since the inception of the theocracy in '79, people are not only openly opposing the 83-year-old Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, which they've done before in 2019, but are actively fighting back against the security forces, toppling police patrol vans and tearing down billboards and burning pictures of the founder of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini. But the most unprecedented part of these protests is that they've been female-led. The murder in custody of the 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, arrested for inappropriate hijab, was the powder keg moment that ignited the most recent uprising. Women have taken to the streets and are not only removing and waving their headscarves, but setting them ablaze and cutting their hair in protest. Young schoolgirls are removing their mandatory head covering and chanting, "We don't want an Islamic Republic." The movement's slogan, "Woman, Life, Freedom," is antithetical to the Islamic Republic, which has built itself on being anti-woman, pro-martyrdom, and repressive. To be clear, this uprising is not just about draconian dress codes. The compulsory hijab has simply become the symbol of the Iranian woman's struggle. Women in Iran have no laws to protect them from gender-based violence. The reversal of many hard-won laws to protect them from gender-based, from injustices at the inception of the 1979 Islamic Revolution saw the legal age of marriage lowered from 18 to 9. This was later raised to 12, but girls as young as 9 can still marry with the permission of their father or a judge. In today's Iran, women cannot travel without the permission of their husband or next male kin. For more than 40 years, women in Iran have not only been fighting against compulsory hijab, but also for their right to choose what they can study, what jobs to hold. Women are forbidden from becoming judges, serving on the Guardian Council, becoming president or supreme leader. Despite this, women are more educated than men in Iran, both a testament to their tenacity and a driving force in their fight for freedom. But the bitter reality is that the Islamic Republic of Iran has become an apartheid state for women, who are segregated from men in the workplace, in classrooms, and at beaches, are banned from attending sports arenas, riding bicycles, and singing solo in public, and have to sit at the back of the bus. According to the World Economic Forum's 2022 Global Gender Gap Report, Iran ranks 143rd of 146 countries. And it's not only women who are calling for an end to theocracy. Brave Iranian men are showing solidarity with the women, striking fear into the heart of a regime that has maintained its power through the segregation of women. This brings us to the first myth, which has sadly been perpetuated not only by representatives of the regime, but also by Western pundits. And that is the myth that compulsory hijab is a cultural issue in Iran that we shouldn't interfere in. But you don't need to subjugate people into observing cultural norms, where people are taking to the streets in the tens of thousands at the least to protest something, despite the risk, the very real risk of death at the hands of the authorities. You can safely assume that is not part of their culture. Another myth is that this regime is reformable. But after a 43-year case study on the Islamic Republic and the rise to the presidency of Ebrahim Raisi, who has been a pillar of the oppressive state, implicated in crimes against humanity, and whose leadership harkens back to 1980s Iran, it's become abundantly clear that a culture of impunity reigns supreme and that the theocracy is impervious to reform. But to be clear, and as we've historically seen, regime change is not synonymous with democracy. I firmly believe the future of Iran can only be written by its own people on its own streets. My hope is that we can find ways to be consistent and principled in our support for human rights, so as not to be mistaken for political expediency. Both sides of the aisle are guilty of either using human rights messaging or remaining silent on human rights abuses to fulfill their policy agendas. Sadly, human rights are often seen as a foreign policy soft topic, but in looking at President Reagan's approach with containing the Soviet threat, human rights were very much a part of the Helsinki Accords. And significant multilateral pressure, along with strategic engagement, brought about substantive change. I believe in building global unity and regional capacity against malign Iranian actions, including human rights abuses. That is what the Iranian people want from us, global solidarity, and to stop turning a blind eye to their suffering in order to fulfill our own political objectives. For 43 years, we've only responded to the symptoms of the Islamic Republic's malign activities with a focus on countering Iran's nuclear ambition and regional aggression. But in order to address the cause, which is the regime itself, we must commit ourselves to intelligently supporting the Iranian people's aspirations for representative government. What does that look like? As we saw in Belarus and are seeing now in Iran, autocracies thrive on cutting the internet when they feel vulnerable, because nothing scares them more than dissidents being able to organize and freely communicate with the world. That's their Achilles heel, which is why it's so important that we invest in ways for Iranians to access uncensored news and information during an internet blackout. And while the 21st century has seen real unity between autocrats, despite any ideological differences they may have, democracies have fallen behind because we lack unity. Iran and Pakistan remain silent or even side with China on the country's atrocities against the Uyghurs. Where autocracies lack principle, we must fill the vacuum with ours. Democracies must stand united in defending against authoritarianism, fighting corruption, and promoting respect for human rights. This must start domestically, when we must start making changes to our own system to overcome any resistance from corporations or groups that benefit from business with autocracies. We must divest from abusive regimes altogether. Our policies should not be set up to empower reformists in Iran. We must focus on empowering Iranian democrats. We must not sell out Iran over concerns by the gap in Russian energy. And the current crisis in Iran calls for us to support, as Amnesty has been calling for, the establishment of an international independent investigative mechanism on human rights abuses in Iran. There are no avenues for justice domestically inside the country. And at a point when the Islamic Republic's state security forces are using disproportionate violence on protesters, it's important to document these human rights violations and atrocity crimes for the purpose of accountability processes. We should further utilize targeted sanctions tools and pass legislation that will allow for seizure of human rights violator assets and repurposing for victims and survivors. To learn more, I'd encourage following the work of human rights lawyer Gisu Nia, whose team at the Strategic Litigation Project, the Atlantic Council, is working to propose, create, and strengthen these tools. And we should shore up war crimes units and prepare to investigate and prosecute Islamic Republic violators. It's only with this level of international coordination and support for accountability and justice for the Iranian people that we can address the Islamic Republic itself as the cause of our nuclear and geopolitical concerns. But one thing is clear: human rights abuses are a symptom of a deep political malaise. Human rights is intricately bound with the respect for the rule of law, and there can be no good governance in the long run without the rule of law. Good and law-abiding governance not only makes for better regional neighbors, but also members of the international community. For 43 years, our foreign policy vis-à-vis Iran has failed us. For a different outcome, we need to change course. Thank you.
Mackenzie, welcome to London. Delighted to be able to receive you on our platform here, and much admired earlier this year your valedictory interview as head of US Central Command when you took Robin Wright on your helicopter around the region in that piece in Atlantic, and very authoritative, articulate statement of the residual, growing indeed, threat of Iran in the region. We very much look forward to hearing what you have to say today.
Dean, thank you, and I'm very proud to be on this panel this morning, and I particularly appreciate the ambassador's remarks that kicked us off this morning, and I'd like to associate myself with those comments. What I would like to do is talk a little bit about Iran, and particularly the nuclear and the conventional dimension of the Iranian threat. Now, a lot of the discussion this morning is going to be on the nuclear dimension, the JICPOA, and as all of you are aware, it is the stated position of the United States that we don't want Iran to possess a nuclear weapon. There are ways to prevent that. We prefer to do it diplomatically. There are alternative ways to do that should that fail. But I'm going to set that aside. I would like to talk about something that has perhaps been obscured by the focus on the Iranian nuclear problem, and that is the growing threat of Iranian conventional weapons in the region. And in particular, I'm talking about three types of weapons. I'm talking about their ballistic missiles, which can range as far as Haifa and to all depths in between. Their land attack cruise missiles, which are low-flying missiles, and their unmanned aerial systems, UAVs and other in the short term. Over the past 5 to 7 years, Iranian capabilities in these three domains have risen to such a degree that now they possess what I would call effective overmatch against their neighbors. Overmatch is a military term that means you have the ability to attack, and the defender will not be able to mount a successful defense. That's a remarkable change, and over these last few years, even as sanctions have been imposed on Iran, they have starved their people, they've perverted their economy, and they've bent their industry to produce these weapon systems. And these are extremely effective systems. We saw in January of 2020 in the attack on al-Assad, the accuracy and capability of Iranian systems. As recently as a few days ago, we saw Iranian missiles reaching to strike the Kurds in northern Iraq. These are genuine, real capabilities. And I would argue that day to day, the possession of those capabilities is perhaps more important to the Iranians than the nuclear file. I think the nuclear program is something they like the idea of being able to have a nuclear weapon. They like the effect it has on the West when they talk about the nuclear weapon. But day to day, it is the maintenance of those conventional capabilities that when I was the CENTCOM commander caused me the most concern. and the capabilities are only growing. So what has been our response? For many years, we've talked about the fact that a war in the central region would be a fires war. It would not be a war of maneuver, would not involve tanks, it would not involve ships to any large degree, would not involve manned airplanes, at least on the Iranian side. What it would involve would be missiles, rockets, and unmanned aerial systems. So how you protect against that is integrated air and missile defense. And that's been a holy grail of CENTCOM for many years. Over the last couple of years, though, we've actually been able to begin take some serious steps to act against the Iranian threat. And while the Iranian threat has risen exponentially and our response has been largely arithmetic, over the last 2 years, we've done some things that I think offer a way forward. First of all, nations in the region understand the very essence of the threat from Iran. They've seen it. The Saudi Aramco attacks in September 2019, other attacks across the region have tended to focus people's minds. Additionally, and fortuitously, the entrance of Israel into the Central Command area of responsibility has given new resources to nations in the region that want to band together to protect themselves against Iranian attacks. I don't want to paint an overly optimistic picture, but I think for the first time, nations in the region understand the imminence of the Iranian threat and the fact that in order to defend themselves, they're going to have to combine against that threat. And I'll close by noting this. The beauty of integrated air and missile defense is nations in the region who are very jealous of their sovereignty don't have to give up much of that sovereignty in order to participate in such an agreement. It really is the sharing of information, is the building of what we call the common operational picture, understanding what's going on, working with your neighbors to share that information, and developing the tactics, the techniques, and the procedures that you need to have to respond to the Iranian threat. So those are all very hopeful signs. And again, I don't want to oversell it, but I'm pleased that we're beginning to see these things. And I know that Central Command now is actively trying to increase that with things like the Red Sands series of exercises and planning that my successor at Central Command, General Kurilla, is now implementing. So I think we face a very grave threat, but I do believe we're taking some steps to maybe, with our neighbors in the region and our neighbors outside of the region, find ways to counter this very concerning series of developments in Iran. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. Great pleasure now to call upon Ambassador Jacques Audibert, who was Foreign Policy Advisor to President Hollande at the Élysée, a key person in negotiating JCPOA-1. Great pleasure to be able to welcome you on our platform. You have, of course, been here once before when Alain Juppé was Foreign Minister and came and spoke here during the Libyan operation. And I must say, I can confess to you now that I took the opportunity to eavesdrop in on your conversation with him when you were using my office then, and I resolved that I would have you come back. Yes, I did. I've resolved to invite you back someday, and we've now finally got you back on the public platform, so delighted to have you, but particularly to reflect because you've negotiated more than anyone here at a high level with the Iranians, and you were one of the, if I can put it this way, the skeptics till the last moment on the last deal, so would be keen to particularly to hear your perspective.
Thank you so much for having me today with you. I first want to say that I cannot more approve what has been said by our colleague in New York about what's happening today in Iran. These young women deserve our deep respect because as we are sitting in London, they risk their life there by demonstrating. And this is something we should, of course, keep in mind. They are fighting for all the values we are fighting for, and they also deserve, of course, our support and our help. How to help them? We have been engaged in this negotiation with the Iranian regime for years. I participated in them as political director. I was the French of the 5+1 group from 2009 in Geneva with Jalili up to 2013 in Geneva as well. With Zarif and the signature of, the approval of the JCPOA. So a few remarks I want to share with you today about that. First, the Iranians want that capacity. They want it more today than ever because they see what's happening to the Ukrainian, who renounced to their nuclear capability in '94 in exchange for guarantee of their border, and then they see what happened. So the Iranians want this capacity more than ever. First. Second, we don't share any value with this regime. They are against all we fight for, all against our interests, our values, our alliances, as we can see in the streets today. third, so how to cope with them today? I want to fight against a cliche I have heard so many times during this year. They are incredibly good negotiators. They invented the chess. They are very poor negotiators. Every diplomat knows, I'm sure I have colleagues here in the room, every diplomat knows that if you face a team made with 6 different nations, as different in their nuclear conception as the French and the Chinese, or the Americans and the Russians, it's easy to split them and to divide them into different factions, and then to win some milestones in the negotiation. They never succeeded, not because they are individually not good negotiators. They are, of course, quite decent professionals, some of them, but because, as we have witnessed for years, every part of this global regime is very busy in trying to undermine any possible success of the other part. When we had any advance with the government, the day after or the week after, you had an article in Kayan, the newspaper of the Guide, undermining this progress. So this is why we did not succeed, and it took us so much time to make some progress, to come to a kind of agreement. Among us, it was sometimes very difficult, as maybe you are aware of. We, the French, were supposed to be the toughest. It's sometimes true, sometimes less, but for example, I was the one raising the hand against the first version of the JCPOA. Everybody was very happy. Okay, it's done. I raised the hand and said, I'm sorry, I have 8 objections. So it took us 1 or 2 more months to come to a decent text, but we succeeded in being united. So did not the Iranian regime. And a last remark about sanctions. You know, it's many people say sanctions never work. They never worked. They are useless. They are painful, and so on. It's not true. Sanctions worked with the Iranian regime. They worked because when Rouhani was elected in 2013, maybe you remember that the heart of his agenda was the lifting of the sanctions through negotiation. So this was a key evolution. Why did they work? Because we included the sanctions in a political process. Sanctions as such are nonsense. Just to humiliate a country, just to punish, that it doesn't work. But if you link sanctions with progress, if you make very clear to your negotiator, to the people you are negotiating with, that if you do this, this sanction will be lifted, but very specific. If you do that, that part of the sanction will be lifted, then you guide them to a process. We had this process with the Iranians. Unfortunately, the Trump administration decided otherwise and went out and ruined the whole process. Today, I consider we are 4 years after this withdrawal. It was in May 2008. 4 years after this withdrawal, we are in a much more unstable, uncertain, and dangerous situation. Thank you.
Thank you. A great pleasure to call upon General Sir Mark Carleton-Smith to speak now. Mark, thank you for your friendship through the years for us, and particularly interested because it's your first appearance since leaving the post of Chief of General Staff, that is your last public appearance in the conversation that you had here with General McConville, Chief of Staff of the US Army. You flagged up the Iranian threat to UK interests in the Gulf and the other UK allies there in the region. Just care for you to reflect on that, both as former Chief of General Staff and as a former Director of Special Forces.
Dean, thank you. And it's lovely to see my old friend Frank on the stage, who gave, I thought, a perfect encapsulation of the military dimension of the problem. Maybe it would be of value if I open the optic marginally on it, because I think from my perspective, this feels like a moment of reckoning. If this isn't to be a crease in history where we witness the high water mark of deterrence and fail to tackle the hot topic and the threat of nuclear blackmail, then this clearly is the moment du jour. And we're dealing not just with a specific issue surrounding Iran, we're dealing with a series of interlinked dossiers and a range of coterminous crises. So this is not, firstly, merely a regional issue, and nor is it just a peripheral threat, because I think how the international community handles not just Iran, but the concurrent threat with respect to Russia is, of course, being very carefully watched by China in the wings, and North Korea will have a keen interest in the outcome as well. And all three of those large powers clearly share a common ambition to establish their own independent spheres of influence, separate to an American-backed global order. And I think what I would observe is that that global order is not self-sustaining, and nor is it self-organizing. It's actually underpinned by power. It's underpinned by hard power, predominantly, albeit not exclusively, American hard power. And Pax Americana today is finding itself increasingly stretched by the concurrent challenges of Russia, China, and Iran at the same time. I would posit, with respect to Iran, that it seems to me that Iran today seems less deterred by American conventional capabilities than it once did. And as a result, it's hard to find amongst the spawning range of crises across the broader Middle East one that doesn't have Iranian fingerprints on it. And Frank emphasized the wider destabilizing challenge of Iran's conventional capabilities, and I would also seek to emphasize that, because Iran today is clearly not a status quo power. It's embarked on a systematic campaign of exploitation to fill the vacuums associated with the changing political geometry of the region, some of which is, unfortunately, the existential legacy of our own interventions, but amongst other things, the traditional Sunni checks and balances seem less credible, less effective, and less potent than they might once have been. As to prospects, I think it's unlikely that we will see stability in the nuclear file while Tehran is subject to sanctions. Its aim, clearly, is to reduce its nuclear breakout time, and it's clearly expanding its nuclear program well beyond that that's strictly required for civilian use. And it does so for three reasons. One is the ultimate insurance policy that a nuclear capability would confer on the regime. Secondly, the negotiating leverage that a nuclear capability affords. And thirdly, the irreversible knowledge gain that they accrue each time negotiations stall. So time and procrastination in this respect is in the regime's interest. The second point I'd make is that any deal is going to be predicated on a combination of trust, transparency, and verification. All three of those crucial factors are anathema to the regime in Tehran. And unless you are highly confident in the scrutiny and the verification and the associated protocols, it's very difficult to have confidence in the efficacy of any deal that the international community might achieve. And perhaps I'm not the only one to think that it's quite hard to envisage a deal with a regime that is shooting its students and bludgeoning its young women to death. Third point I'd make is, even if you can picture a world where the regime is in full compliance with a deal, Tehran is still guilty, as Frank said, of a range of wider destabilizing activity with respects to its growing inventory of its ballistic missile programs, of growing lethality, range, and precision. It is a state sponsor of terrorism, and it has an active program of destabilization with respects to its surrogates and its proxies. None of those are covered by the protocols of any JCPOA deal. And all of those become more acute without a deal, and more acute if in the end Iran achieves a nuclear capability. And so I think my bottom line is it's hard to picture peace across the broader Middle East with a nuclear capable Iran. And yet at the same time, I think the international's community's ability to prevent Iranian ambition in that respect has to be questionable today. And I think we have little confidence that an inadequate compromise deal is going to prevent their achieving their ambition.
Thank you. Another first now, Mohammed Ali Ayer, welcome here, Policy Exchange, first time editor-in-chief of Al Arabiya, also the Harvard Belfer Center and the Hudson Institute in Washington. Very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say as one of the most important regional voices in the commentary and the academic sphere.
Thanks very much for having me. I think General McKenzie made some very important points about Iran's conventional capabilities and how they've actually changed over the past 5 or 6 years, almost to a point where you know, what they looked like is no longer recognizable. Regional actors tend to criticize the nuclear deal or be uneasy about the nuclear deal because they see that they are the actors that are within range of Iran's ballistic missiles, within range of Iran's proxies, while the P5+1 is comprised of a set of countries, none of whom are within range of Iran's conventional capabilities, be they proxies on the ground that utilize these power vacuums we spoke about, or within range of Iran's ballistic missiles and UAVs. So the issue today is that, you know, people in the region have seen firsthand what the aftermath of the 2015 JCPOA was at the Levant and on the Gulf. Iran was empowered along with Russia and Syria to slaughter 500,000 people. We've seen the proliferation of Iranian proxies, over 100 Shia militias in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere across the Levant. And that came directly as a result of an empowered and you know, well-resourced IRGC. All of these things happened directly in the aftermath of the 2015 JCPOA, and that was a price that was paid. It was paid in Syria. It was paid, you know, by essentially this post-Pax Americana, post-Soviet collapse American security order in the region that no longer looked like itself, and that created palpable confusion. Whether you spoke to officials in Saudi Arabia or the UAE or Israel, and any country really that considers itself a partner to this international Western security order. People were wondering, you know, what's the future of this order? What role do they play? And these are countries that have in the past acted as pillars to protect this order. So today we're seeing that there is more apprehension than there was in 2015 because the anxieties and the questions in the minds of policymakers in the Gulf were answered by Iran's interventions in Syria, by its creation of a power vacuum in Iraq. You know, Western intervention in Iraq did create a power vacuum, but it's also important to remember that Iran can only spread its influence in these countries when there is an absence of state power, an absence of a group that exercises the monopoly over the use of force and control over borders. All of these things are very bad for Iran, bad for the cultivation of these proxies. So what we see is that Iraq is being pulled back by Iran in order for the Revolutionary Guard to spread their influence by proxy across the region. So the worry today is that if there is a return to the JCPOA, there will be a situation where Iran, within the next 9 years, as these sunset clauses expire, have a direct path to a nuclear weapon, and then dozens upon dozens of billions of dollars that will allow it to grow this regional proxy network across the region. And one of the points that was used to perhaps sell the Iran deal was this idea that there are reformists in the government that should be supported in order to disadvantage these so-called hardliners, and Nazanin mentioned this. It's worth noting that the proliferation of proxies across the region happened under these so-called reformists. It happened under Rouhani, it happened under Jawad Zarif, and all of these so-called reformist figures in the Iranian government. They didn't happen under Ahmadinejad. There was barely any growth in Iran's proxy footprint under Ahmadinejad. So the idea, I think, that there is a reformist wing and a hardline wing in the Iranian government, and that by crafty policy making, one can manipulate the situation in order to create to bring about a safer Iran or a less hostile Iran is a problematic idea. So the fear today is that if there is a return to the JCPOA, the nuclear problem isn't solved. It's not 2015 anymore, it's 2022. And not only that, we're going to see a deterioration, a very rapid deterioration of the security situation as a result of these funds being used towards cultivation of ballistic missiles and proxies across the region, precisely in the same way that the Iranians have done in the aftermath of the 2015 JCPOA. And lastly, I think these protests are important even for the discussion on the JCPOA and the larger discussion on how to deal with Iran. There seem to be two ways that states in the region are opting to deal with youth. One way is the Iranian regime's way and the way that its proxies, be they Hezbollah or its other proxies in Iraq, are dealing with young people. And that is to utilize backwards, reactionary, anti-Western, violent Islamism in order to crush the aspirations of these young people. And Iraq, for example, many of whom were born after the US invasion of Iraq. And then you have other countries, namely the Gulf countries, that are opting to do the exact opposite. To draw on the strengths of young people to crush the aspirations of these Islamist countercurrents that have long been competitors, political competitors to these states and these monarchies in the Gulf. So it's an exact opposite situation that we're seeing now. Now, this is important for policy making because I believe that the Iranian regime's model is in a race against time. Young people are more plugged in to the international community. They see what other young people are doing across the world and indeed, of course, across the region. And what we see among Arab Shias in Iraq, for example, is that recruiting them, especially absent the resources needed to pay young people to fight in militias, is becoming ever more difficult. And that's something that I might disagree with Ambassador Odiber. Of course, having sanctions that are tied to a political process is ideal and it's important, but sanctions also do serve a certain purpose on their own. It might not be ideal, it might not be the most efficient way to draw policy, but sanctions do limit the regime's ability to fund, cultivate these proxy networks and spread its influence in the region. At the end of the day, the Iranian regime needs US dollars in cash in order to maintain a very bloated regional proxy network. Many point to the Iranian model in the region and say that Iran has a much smaller cost structure than other conventional militaries in the region. That's true for one or two militias. It starts getting very tedious when it's dozens upon dozens of militias, and that requires considerable resources, as does the cultivation of the ballistic missiles programs and UAV programs, etc., etc. So, in the long term, can one be optimistic? I think that's the case. Again, demographics are very important in the region. Regional states and indeed many other states around the world have the opposite problem that Europe has, which is that you've got youth bulges and birth rates well above replacement level. The same can be said about Gulf states. The same can be said about Iran, perhaps with the exception of the Persian Shia part of Iran. Birth rates are well above replacement levels. And the idea today is, which model is going to be adopted in order to deal with this demographic reality going forward in the region. And these protests, I think, are extremely telling on where young people stand, as were the protests against the Revolutionary Guards and against Khamenei by young Shias in Babel in Iraq and elsewhere in that country. The thrust and the energy is going quite squarely in one direction.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation, and I know there'll be many questions arising out of it now. Always important to have political echelon representing political leadership critical, and that's where your voice, Dr. Fox, comes in as former Secretary of State for Defense and regular visitor to the Gulf and beyond, and just the responsibility that falls upon elected leaderships in democratic societies.
Oh, thank you very much, and it's lovely to be back, even debating such a sad topic as this. And I think the first thing I would say is to echo some of the comments already made, that the very brave women who are on the streets of Iran today are not fighting for women's rights. They're fighting for all the rights that we take for granted in the free world. Human rights, a non-theocratic rule of law, and the concepts of self-determination and democracy. We mustn't simply portray this as a battle of the women of Iran against the regime. This is a battle that we should all be engaged in, because it's the battle that matters most to all of us. And the second I would echo is what the ambassador told us from New York, and which should be said a lot more. The problem is not the behavior of the regime in Iran. The problem is the regime in Iran itself. It is, their behavior is the essence of what they are. And that is what we need to recognize. Those of you who are interested in the subject may have read a short book by Karim Sanjapur from the Carnegie Endowment for Peace in New York called Reading Hamani. And it sets out in a very short volume that his speeches, his articles, his utterances over decades have been utterly consistent. His desire to retain the purity of the Islamic Revolution, his detestation for the existence of Israel, and his hatred of the United States. Most politicians in the West would give their eye teeth for the sort of consistency that he has shown over that time, but unfortunately this most, I think, wicked mindset is utterly consistent, and I completely agree. We have shown far too much wishful thinking with Iran as elsewhere when it comes to the so-called reformers. That's like saying Stalin was a reformer for Lenin. We are not going to get the sort of reformers that we would think about as reformers inside the Iranian system. So we've got a couple of practical problems we have to deal with politically. One is the rise of the IRGC. When we talk about Iran, we've got a state within a state, a very powerful state within a state, with the IRGC, their own schools, their own towns, even their own holiday resorts, a large control over the means of production in Iran itself, in things like oil and gas, automotive, naval. The IRGC is becoming more and more powerful inside that. The IRGC, whose rule is not just border control, but control the security for the regime, instrumental in crushing the Green Movement after the stolen election in 2009. And I just say on that point that we had an opportunity then to actually come out in support of the people of Iran. And if I compare it to, say, in the Cold War, solidarity in Poland, we couldn't do very much to help solidarity, but we could give them moral support, and we did. Mrs. Thatcher, President Reagan came out and gave strong support. At the time of the Green Movement, we didn't even give them moral support. I regard it as the lowest moral point in recent Western politics. We've got a chance to make amends today by giving much greater support to what is happening in Iran. So we need to deal with the IRGC because it's linked to the whole JCPOA issue. We need to recognize that through the Quds Force, that they've been in Lebanon, they've been helping the Taliban. Through other elements, we've had political activity in France, in the Netherlands, even in the United Kingdom, and we need to recognize they are a real danger in themselves. And I think that the United Kingdom should join the United States in prescribing the IRGC as a terrorist organization. We should be very, very clear about what our intent is. And the second thing is with the JCPOA. I was never as much a supporter of the JCPOA for many of the reasons that have been given. It didn't deal with Iran's destabilization of its neighbors, its religious ambitions, its export of terror to the region and now beyond. And I don't think we should sign an agreement that simply aims to put back Iran's ability to become a nuclear weapon state. The original aim of the JCPOA was to stop Iran becoming a nuclear weapon state. Delaying it is a different level of ambition altogether. So I think that we need to be really careful about where we go there. And then the third thing is in relation to Russia. I cannot understand why we've been so silent in our condemnation and the actions that we take about Iran's support for Russia in its brutal suppression in Ukraine. And when we know that Iran's been shipping and taking by its own aircraft drones and other help to Russia so that they can inflict death and suffering on the people of Ukraine. Why are we allowing Iran Air to fly into Heathrow every day of the week? It's time we started to take real measures, and I would ban Iran Air from coming and using civil aviation space in the United Kingdom. Now, people will say, well, so what? You actually have to make a stand, and you've got to take measures that send very clear signals. And to say we are against all of these things, but you can fly direct once a day from London to Tehran on Iran Air just doesn't make any sense to me. And so I think that we now need to take those three measures. No signing of the JCPOA until it gets tougher, prescribing the IRGC, and banning Iran Air. There are three things that we can do practically, and I think that we are called on politically to do so.
Thank you. So much food for thought there. Just if I could ask, we do have a big international audience as well, people coming in on remote online. If you would just stick up your electronic hands, that would be very much appreciated. I know there'll be plenty of questions. I'm just trying to get a flavour from the room who wants to ask a question. Gentleman there in the far corner by the door, just give your name and organisation just for the exigence.
Member of Parliament from Birmingham, Perry Bar. The issue of Iran, ever since the Ayatollah Khamenei takeover, has been there, has been ever present. And we, and particularly the US, has played along with it by and large, by trying to see, oh, somebody will come in and there'll be a more moderate regime and we'll do something about it. Whatever it did in Syria, whatever it's done in Lebanon, and continues to do huge well. It carries out attacks in Saudi Arabia on the oil storage tanks, nothing, no reprisal at all, no mention of any sort of comeback on what Iran has done. What it's done to its own population, we don't seem to be doing anything. Sanctions are part of what we're trying to look at, but really not going to achieve anything. It's not going to stop the nuclear ambitions either. What they're also doing now in terms of social access to people through Al Jazeera, the recent episode of Labour Files, and there'll be one about the Conservatives as well. And that's looking at us here and how to attract the young people away from the mainstream politics, which is what's happening. We have issues in Parliament here, which we have to address some of their supporters who are very keen here to deal with that. And Dr. Fox is quite right, looking at some of these sanctions that we need to have, which are practical things that we can do to move forward. I think everybody gave a fairly clear summary of the whole thing. But when are we going to get down to actually doing some real things to actually stop this regime to continue to do that? Supporting the women who are out there at the moment, the young girls who are out there, is fantastic. But I think unless we get more stricter, nothing will happen. The same will carry on in here another 10 years. I was saying, what are we going to do about their nuclear program now? What are they doing? So,
was the question directed at anyone?
the question is that what are we going to do? Rather than just looking at all this, we're doing the same thing. The same questions are arising. We're looking at sanctions are not good enough. Unless we have some greater influence in what they're doing at the moment, we're not going to be able to move anything along. And you'll be ruining the day that they will end up with a full nuclear capability, and we'll say, what do we do now?
Anyone want to come in?
Well, I mean, I would agree, and I think, again, right at the beginning, the ambassador in New York was talking about sanctioning those who are seen to be human rights abusers, not just the regime, but let's go for the individuals. Let's go for the families, those who are supplying the support to groups like the IRGC. Why are we not sanctioning individuals there, as well as prescribing the organisation itself? I mean, we need to get a bit of a move on this, and there are a couple of elements in that. One is, I'd like to see the British media be a lot more critical of Iran than it is. We get endless reports about human rights abuses in other countries, way more than you get on human rights abuses in Iran, and I've never really understood why that should be the case. So I'm all for it if that's an offer of a joint front in Parliament to put some pressure to move in that direction. I'm all in favour of that, but I do think it is important to give moral support at every opportunity. Every member of Parliament should be standing up and giving moral support to those on the front line in Iran, because, as I said, what happened in 2009 was a disgrace. We should all be ashamed of the lack of support that we gave. At least we can get it right this time. And supporting the mechanisms that allow information in to people in Iran, making sure that they are able to see from the internet what the rest of us are able to see, and the interpretations that the rest of the world is making about their country. It's true that the demographics tend to suggest change, but that change can be a long time coming, and a lot of terrible suffering can take place within that period. So I would favour us moving much faster.
Anyone else want to come in on that question from the member for Birmingham Perry Bar? Anybody? Okay, gentleman there in the front. No, in the front. Just thank you. Yeah, you just state your name and organisation for the exegesis.
Well, we do know each other, Dean, but yeah.
But others might not know you.
Frank Gardner, BBC security correspondent. If Nazanin is still on the line, my question is primarily for her, but do feel free to, I'd be interested to hear your views. In 2009, there was a really interesting study by an Iranian-American academic who looked at the science of protest movements and what it would take for the momentum to reach such a point that people no longer feared arrest, imprisonment, and torture. And it didn't quite reach that point in 2009 because the Iranian regime, the Sepah, the Basij, and so on, were very adept at taking people out from the streets, torturing them so badly and then releasing them that they spread the word, oh my God, what they did to me, it's not worth it. What do you think, Nazanin, if you're still there,
yes.
and I'd be interested, great, what do you think it will take for this movement to gather such a momentum that so many people come out on the streets that this regime falls?
That's a great question, thank you. I think frankly, we are seeing that. Prominent, celebrated Iranian actress inside Iran, Katayoum Riahi, bravely gave an interview to an Iranian news outlet outside, actually based in London, without her compulsory hijab, in solidarity with Mahsa Amini. And she said, frankly, people are no longer afraid of prison because Iran has become a prison itself. And that is what we're seeing right now. I would agree with our honourable friend who said that the news media isn't covering this enough. Because if they truly were, if you're seeing what I'm seeing on a daily basis, which is images of Ayatollah Khomeini being burned, and women, young girls standing in classrooms without their hijab on, singing freedom anthems. These are people who are no longer scared. The toppling of patrol vans, the attacking security, or not attacking, but defending themselves against these security forces. We are seeing that. And I think we're starting to see, even in celebrity culture in America and the UK, of people standing up and showing solidarity with the protesters and the Iranian people. There are elements of what we saw with apartheid South Africa and the anti-apartheid movement. What we need is exactly that solidarity. We need Western media and lawmakers to stand up, condemn the Iranian government, introduce accountability mechanisms, and call it for what it is. It's starting to become a genocide of their own people. And as long as that doesn't happen, we don't have any hope. The Iranian people are calling for the global media and global leaders to stand with them.
Anyone else want to come in on Frank Gardner's question? Any one of the other panellists who hasn't yet spoken in these stanza of questions?
Yeah, I mean, also I think it's important noting that the difference today is that the regime is in open war against young women and girls in the streets. I mean, it's very difficult to obfuscate that or to blame Israel or blame separatists or blame Saudi Arabia or blame, and they're doing it on camera, right? And that's just much more egregious also than what they've been doing in the past, and they haven't just done it once. It seems the solution to these uprisings that are protesting women being killed is to kill more women on a daily basis. So I mean, it is different, I think, this time.
Thank you. I see a question online from Arlene Foster. Is it the Arlene Foster who was First Minister of Northern Ireland? Can you hear me?
Yes, it is. Can you hear me, Dean?
Welcome, Arlene. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just really to Nazanin and Liam, I would address this question. I mean, Nazanin made the point that the regime was not capable of reform, and then went on to say, however, that the the challenge was for the Iranian people. And then Liam took up that point by saying we needed to show moral support in a way that we didn't do in 2009. I really wanted to just tease out, what does that moral support actually look like? What does it mean in practice? And maybe both of them may have some thoughts around that. Thank you.
Nazanin.
In my opinion, I think I outlined it in my remarks, but there is a real need for us to find ways to allow Iranians to communicate with the world, not to have the Iranian government authorities black out, shut down the internet, and then continue to kill people with impunity. That's one way of supporting them, is an active way of supporting them. But also, words matter. And I think that the absence of that in 2009 was glaring for Iranians. We need people to vocalize, world leaders to vocalize the support and then follow it up with actions. And, you know, I think we have to keep in mind, I think it was former ambassador, American ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, who said arms controllers didn't end the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Democrats inside Russia and other Soviet republics did. And similarly, our friend Karim Sajjadpour wrote last year in The Atlantic that the US-Iran Cold War will likely be concluded not by American diplomats, but by Iranian Democrats. And with that in mind, we have to do everything in our power to empower those Democrats.
Good, thank you. Did I see a gentleman up on the wall next to Khalid Mahmood wanted to ask a question? Name and organisation, please.
It was a comment, Dean, on William Frank.
Just say who you are, please.
John Jenkins, Policy Exchange, former British ambassador to various countries in the region. Two things, when we talk about what makes revolutions succeed, I mean, I think if you have a regime like Iran's, which is prepared to kill enough of its own citizens, and has established under Khamenei a massive Praetorian apparatus to keep the regime secure, I think it is always going to be hard, unless the regime itself cracks. Now, there's been a lot of speculation about the health of Ayatollah Khamenei. There's been a lot of speculation about his health actually for the last 25 years. But at some point he will go. And it'll be really interesting to see what happens, because it looks as if there are divisions within the regime about whether it's going to be Raisi, who's the current president, who's got a very mixed reputation, or Mujtaba, who's Khamenei's son, and so forth. I think in terms of what we do, in terms of the moral support and the rest of it, I think it is important. But there are two things, practical things you can do in the meantime. One is intelligence-led. And I think it's really important to have an intelligence-led response to this. This is, after all, how the Israelis, although they will deny it, have done it. And there were lots of allies in the region who will help. I think what we know about what's happening inside Iran is very thin these days. I think there has been a decline in the capacity of the intelligence agencies, certainly in this country, maybe in continental Europe and so forth, to work out what's going on. The second thing is money. I mean, if you look at Iran, at the IRGC, the Hezbollah network, which is IRGC, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the various Hezbollah organizations in Iraq, and so forth, they are not just revolutionary organizations, movements, Praetorian state, and so forth. They're also part of a massive global criminal enterprise. I mean, Mohammed will know in Saudi Arabia, the whole issue of Captagon, the drug trade, which is huge for Hezbollah and spans the Middle East, West Africa, Latin America, and so forth. Do something about that. The U.S. Treasury, with the FBI and the agency, were very good about this until the first Obama administration. Then a lot of it got shut down or lapsed, and I think that was partly because of the emphasis that was put on the JCPOA. Mm-hmm. But that's something where there is the possibility for genuine collective action, much stronger and more effective collective action globally. Now than we've seen over the last decade. Thank you.
Anyone want to come in on that? Anyone here on this side? Can I just ask, just picking up on Jacques Audibert's point earlier, which is that they're not 10 feet tall as a negotiator. You've been obviously ambassador in Iraq and Syria, Sir John, just interested in your view of their negotiating and their trade, their capacities. Are they 10 feet tall or not, as Jacques Audibert?
They're not 10 feet tall, but they're incredibly persistent. And for them, the region, their immediate environment is their strategic protection. In Iraq, every single ambassador in Iraq, every single ambassador in Syria, when I was in Syria, was an IRGC, a senior IRGC officer. They were also actually clerics at the same time. I mean, there is this interesting thing in Iran where you get clerics in the IRGC, the clericalization of the IRGC and the IRGCization of the clerisy. And they have strategic patience. And as various people have pointed out, Khamenei has, the Iranians have been very consistent in what they've said over the last 30 years about what it is they want to do. And I've never understood why people don't think that A, that's what they want to do, and B, that this consistency doesn't matter. It does. I mean, this is the fundamental, this is the underpinning of the state. The destruction of Israel. I mean, Karim, the great Karim Sajapur, has said that there were three pillars of the Iranian regime. One is death to America, one is death to Israel, and the other is the hijab. And that's actually, those are the pillars. Now, those are the pillars you have to go for.
Thank you. Can I just take advantage of just using Chairman's privilege a second? Is just, in terms of the power of the Iranian regime, so-called. If all three of you looking at it, I mean, one can understand why we are reluctant, the West collectively and indeed democracies in the Indo-Pacific, to how do we deal with the power of a massive growing China, which has been growing economically, been growing militarily, and how do we all collectively help Taiwan, for example, if there were to be PRC aggression in that part of the world. It's a very, very big country. Iran is Persia is a great civilization, the Iranians are a great people, but this regime has immiserated its people. It's, obviously no kind of political model for the younger people. It's in economic trouble of all kinds, Yet we treat it, or Iran, almost as though it is the People's Republic of China. In other words, we can't seem to really get a grip on it, and by comparison, as a state, it's inconsequential. It's a minority strain within the broader Ummah. It's a minority. Khomeiniite Shiism is perhaps, one might argue, a minority strain within Shiism as a whole, yet it's managed to cease it. So my question is, all three of you have been using the levers of state power through the years in your respective countries, diplomatic level, military level. You've been privy to NSC deliberations in the United States, highest level, Mark on our NSC as well. Why do we find it so hard to deal with this country?
Closest to you, I'll be glad to begin. But first of all, if I could just go back to some of the points that have been made about the degree to which the Iranian regime will go to protect itself. I believe they will impose genocidal measures, and they'll do that without blinking an eye. And so we kid ourselves if we think we can apply half-hearted measures externally and not have lots of people die inside Iran. And the very act of giving succor to those people in Iran will tend to mobilize elements of the Iranian population against us, and will give leverage to the Iranian regime to mobilize against the outside enemy, which has always been a very important part of Iranian politics, as the ambassador just noted a few minutes ago. Death to America, death to Israel. So I think we just need to be very open-eyed and very realistic about what the Iranian regime will do, because their number one priority will be regime self-protection. We know that. So we just need to be aware of that if we're going to enter into this. So I think one of the key reasons that we have not been able to come to terms with Iran is we give an intermittent focus. The United States turns to the region when there's a crisis, then we turn away, and we want to be a global power, but we don't realize that in order to be a genuine global power, you have to have persistent focus around the world, and we have not mastered that. In fact, we've been very maladroit in the way that we have exercised at the political level in the Middle East, and Iran is probably the shining example of that. And because of that, I think it's made it very difficult to be consistent dealing with Iran. And for me, at least, that was certainly my frustration as the Central Command Commander.
Brilliant, thank you. Ambassador Oliver.
We do negotiate with them. We have been negotiating with them. We keep on. I didn't expect a lot of support for the JCPOA here, but first, don't worry, I would be very surprised if it comes back to life one day, and certainly not before the midterms elections. If I were any American administration, I would be a bit reluctant to make a compromise with the Iranians before these midterm elections. So it's not going to happen, but we have, believe me, I spent hundreds of hours discussing with dozens of different Iranian delegations. They are not all the same. And you can bring them towards where we want them to go, which is not acquiring that capability. We have not insisted enough today on the catastrophic effect of the Iranian acquiring, I don't want to use military language, but an operational nuclear capability. This would be the end of the NPT, the end of a milestone of our security system. We just cannot accept this to happen. So I didn't hear today a lot of many alternatives to a robust agreement because we know what are the alternatives, and this is certainly not where we want to go. But again, I insist on it, whatever it takes. We cannot afford to have them acquire that capability. Look what today the Russian regime can afford to do under the umbrella of the nuclear capability. We all were discovered the international relation in the last 40 years based on the fact that the nuclear power made the war impossible. Today, it makes the war possible. So we cannot afford to have the Iranian doing that. I think that we have to go on trying to find a way to delay. Let's be pragmatic. If you cannot prevent them from acquiring that capability forever, okay, let's delay. The JCPOA would have delayed this for 10 years. Now they are on the verge of having this capability, at least in terms of fuel. So we are in a more dangerous situation, and let's keep in mind that, again, I want to insist, we cannot afford to have the Iranians acquiring that capability. But we discuss with them. We are not reluctant to do so. We are not always successful. They are very tough negotiators, tough but not good, as I told you, which makes things even more complicated, believe me. And this is where we are today. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark.
I mean, I don't imagine the United Kingdom thought that Iran was explicitly our problem, and we are as guilty as the United States of variable geometry around the relative attention and resource that we've been prepared to commit to the problem. We've certainly been guilty of wishful thinking, and that's not just true of Iran. I'm not convinced that we necessarily have listened as sensitively to regional voices as we might have done. And actually, as you travel around the Baltic states and Poland today, they would absolutely echo that with respects to the challenge that we now find with Russia.
Thank you. Frank Allen, you just want to come in a second, then I'll give a final clutch of questions to others. Sorry, you had a supplementary.
Sure. Thanks. This is really for you, Mr. Audebert. Do you think it's possibly the case that every month that goes by without a JCPOA deal, it becomes increasingly irrelevant because Iran is working towards breakout capability, it's doing things in secret, it's not being properly monitored. There is clearly a strong caucus in Iran that doesn't want to see the JCPOA renewed. They're doing very nicely with their underground research. They're stringing the West and the community along. So is the JCPOA almost an irrelevance now? I mean, we still talk about it, but what's the point of it if it's almost too late?
We should change its name. JCPOA would not come back. Let's say another agreement. I agree. This is what I meant by saying that today's situation is much more dangerous than 4 years ago, when it has been decided to get out of this fragile, certainly not perfect, but an agreement. And again, we contributed to make it more robust than it did. And today, we all know that the Iranians are progressing, and it will be even more difficult to come back to an agreement. You know, it's more difficult to negotiate with somebody, especially our Iranian friends, by telling them you should get rid of what you have, than telling them please do not acquire that. You see, it's much more difficult. And this is what my colleague will face in the future, but we have to try to do that because stopping doing that would lead to what solution? You have any credible, efficient solution to prevent that?
I don't, but my point is that would it even make any difference? They're going to do what they're doing anyhow. They're stringing you along.
No, because what we witnessed is that when they signed, they abide by their obligation. They used to do with
until 2019.
Yes. They did, but as today, it's over. They even went out of the NPT, as far as I know. So they got rid of all their obligation, and they respected some of them in terms of IAEA, monitoring capabilities and things like that. They did.
Final trio of questions. I'm going to disappoint somebody, so my apologies here, Tony, but there's been a gentleman waiting patiently there by the pillar. You just give your name and organisation, please.
James Fierro with the Eco Capacity Exchange.
Quick question, I'm sorry to hurry you.
It's going to be
along,
quick.
I've been
I don't think, and I think we would all agree that nuclear capacity in Iran is inevitable. Why are we wasting time on that one? Why don't we focus on what is important? It's not whether they have nuclear capacity or conventional weapons. It's the regime needs to change. Why aren't all the resources being devoted to all of these other matters being not voted to changing the regime? That's what has to happen.
Thank you. And there are two more questions. Gentleman in the middle there on the left side, as I look at it. Thank you. Name and organisation, please.
Thank you. Damien McElroy from the National. I wanted to just ask about the JCPOA. Isn't the real problem it's become a kind of blockage in Western policy in that people say they are negotiating on the JCPOA and they're not coming up with other policies like containment or something. So, you know, public in Europe have seen criminal trials about Iran activity in terms of threatening security. Even here, people see the Iranian missile threat as something of a security threat. Isn't there a wider Western policy response that's gone by the wayside because of 10 years of obsession about JCPOA?
Thank you. And one more question behind you there, just towards the back. There's a gentleman there, further back on that side. Yes. Thank you. Yes. You had your hand up patiently from the start.
I forgot
so
my questions.
I didn't want you to think I overlooked you.
Ad Hamazia, fellow of at Harvard with Mohammed and Highbridge Advisory. So John Jenkins mentioned a couple of points around Hezbollah. Oil wasn't mentioned in Petrochem's sanctions. Thinking about swing state or global swing state in India, Lebanon connectivity and Iraq, what can really be done to stifle those flows, given the fact that there is no plugging, whether it be Saudi Arabia or the West, quote unquote? And then just, you know, what is the symbolic value of the recent signing on memoranda with the SCO, with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? And then finally, if General Mackenzie wanted to maybe say anything on what a DeSantis would do in 2025 with Iran. Thank you very much.
It may not be a fair question, even though he is a Florida rebel. Yes. General.
You know, I'm not going to actually touch that one. Thank you for asking. We can all consider it.
The big geopolitical stuff that he was talking about.
So I think Iran is, I'm a little at a variance from many things that have been said here today about Iran's relationship to possessing a nuclear weapon. I think they like being on the bridge of being able to go to one. I think they like being at that place. I think they like going to being able to break out. But I also think we should not overlook the friction and inefficiency in the regime in Iran that might allow nuclear refinement to continue, perhaps if not everyone in the government wanted it to happen. So I think we should be cautious, assuming that it's a monolithically driven problem set and the Iranians are all of one mind going forward. You're right, it may not matter if they get to breakout state, wherever that's going to be. But I really believe they like the nuclear program as a wedge to use against us. And they like the idea of being able to pursue it. I haven't seen, to me at least, convincing evidence that they want to have a nuclear weapon next year. Now, there are events that could occur that could change that. Again, that's just the view that I have of it.
Thank you. Mohammed. Or any range of those questions that you want to ask the kids.
The last part of your question again.
SCO, or Lebanon, Iraq, Iran flows, India, oil.
Yeah, I mean, I don't quite understand fully the negotiations right now between Israel and Lebanon, the maritime border. It seems that the Lebanese have gotten a lot of the concessions that they've been looking for over the past years, well beyond the Hofline, whatever direction you see it going in. Apparently, there was a Russian company that had 20% of this deal. That Russian company is no longer involved in Lebanon. Question is, who is the actor that is coming in with cash to fill that 20% position. It certainly isn't the Lebanese government, which doesn't have much money to put anywhere. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting for me, the Lebanon situation, because you know, at the end of the day, one must call a spade a spade. Lebanon is an Iranian satrapy today, and you know, it's Iranian Hezbollah, Iran's most important proxy, Hezbollah, that controls the borders, monopolizes use of force, and uses force to control the political process. So it will be interesting to see what happens there in terms of energy.
Ambassador Oliver.
On your questions, yeah, JCPOA as such, this way I'm concerned we should change the focus of the text. You're right, but maybe you remember that it was first considered as a first step towards a more global agreement, including ballistic missiles and including the role of Iran in destabilizing the region. So it was considered as a first step. You're right, it doesn't make sense only to discuss on that, but as we have to be pragmatic, we discuss on that. But again, as for me, I'm no more in the discussion at all, but I would be very surprised if we have a breakthrough in the coming month.
Just two very quick points. So John raised the point about the Praetorian Guard, as it were. Lots of that Praetorian Guard, as Sir John said, are not clerics. A lot of those are individuals who will be looking out for their own interests in the longer term. And those Praetorian Guards are made of people. And we should not be afraid to sanction those individuals and to make sure that they understand that their personal interests are not well placed in the longer term by being supportive of the regime. We need to find ways of doing that, particularly economically. Secondly, maybe it's only a difference of tone with General Mackenzie. I had friends in 2009 who were badly treated by the authorities. I had friends who were imprisoned by the authorities in Iran, and they said, why did you not speak up for us? They knew what would happen when the authorities tried to repress the Green Movement. What they couldn't understand was why we said nothing. And if we say nothing for fear of the regime using our statements against those who are bravely on the streets, I think that's a wrong decision for us to make. When people who are on the streets are asking us to stand up and be counted internationally, I think that's our duty to do so. And I think that we should have done it more in 2009, and I think we should have learned the lesson and make sure that we do it today.
Thank you. Last word, General Carson Smith.
Well, I think the nature and character of the regime has been fully revealed, and we wouldn't want to be guilty of any association with a policy that smacks of appeasement.
So, crisp last word. True General's orders. Thank you. Thank you. Brilliant panel.